Good morning, everybody. Our sermon this morning is based on Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 to 30, and the theme is that there is no salvation without God. St. Paul's appeal to the Philippians is more than an appeal to live in unity in a given situation. It is an appeal to live a life which will lead to the salvation of God in both time and in eternity. Nowhere in the New Testament is the work of salvation more succinctly stated than in verses 12 and 13. Paul tells us, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you and will act in order to fulfill his purpose." As always with St. Paul's, the words are meticulously chosen. It is as if he says, don't stop halfway. Go on until the work of salvation is fully wrought out in you. God's action cannot be frustrated, nor can it remain half finished. It must be fully effective, and no Christian should be satisfied with anything less than the total benefits of the gospel. The first 7 verses of this section give a perfect statement of the work of salvation. Firstly, salvation is of God. It is God that works in us the desire to be saved. It is true that our hearts are restless till they rest in him. And it remains true that we could not even begin to seek him unless he had already found us. The desire for the salvation of God is not kindled by any human emotion, but by God himself. The beginning of the process of salvation is awakened by God. The continuance of that process is dependent on God, as without his help, there can be no progress in goodness. Without his help, no sin can be conquered and no virtue achieved. The end of the process of salvation is with God, for its end is friendship with God, in which we are his and he is ours. The work of salvation is begun and continued and ended in God. Secondly, salvation is of man. Work out your own salvation, Paul demands. Without man's cooperation, even God is helpless. The fact is that any gift or any benefit has to be received. A man may be ill and the doctor able to prescribe the drugs that will cure him, but the man will not be cured unless he takes the medicine, and he may stubbornly refuse all persuasion to do so. It is so with salvation. The offer of God is there. Without it, there can be no such thing as salvation. But no man can ever receive salvation unless he answers God's appeal and takes what he offers. There can be no salvation without God, but what God offers, man must take. It is never God who withholds salvation. It is always man who deprives himself of it. When we examine the chain of thought in this passage, we see that Paul sets down 5 signs of salvation, as we may call them. There is the sign of effective action. The Christian must give continual evidence in his daily life that he is indeed working out his own salvation day by day. It must be more fully accomplished. The true Christian life must be a continual process, for it is a journey towards God. There is the sign of fear and trembling. This is not the fear and trembling at the prospect of punishment. It comes from two things. It comes first from a sense of our own creature lives and our own powerlessness to deal with life triumphantly. It comes second from an horror of grieving God. When we do really love a person, we are not afraid of what they may do to us. We are afraid of what we may do to them. The Christian's great fear is of crucifying Christ again. There is the sign of serenity and certainty. The Christian will do all things without grumbling and questioning everything. In the Christian life, there is the serenity and the certainty of perfect certainty and perfect trust. There is the sign of purity. Christians are to be blameless and innocent and without blemish. Each of these words makes its contribution to the idea of Christian purity. As a Christian, life is of such purity that none can find anything in it with which to find fault. It is often said in courts of law that the proceedings must not only be just, but must be seen to be just. The Christian must not only be pure, but the purity of his life must be seen by all. There is the sign of missionary endeavor. The Christian offers to all the word of life. That is to say, the word which gives life. The Christian missionary endeavor has two aspects. It is a proclamation of the offer of the gospel in words that are clear and unmistakable, and it is a witness of a life that is absolutely straight in a world that is warped and twisted. It is the offer of light in a world which is dark. Christians are to be the lights in the world. They offer a demonstrative straightness in a twisted world and a light into a dark world. Paul was perfectly willing to make his life a sacrifice to God. And if that happened to him, it would be a joy, and he calls on them not to mourn at the prospect, but rather to rejoice. To him, every call to sacrifice and to toil was a call to his love for Christ, and therefore he met it not with regret and complaint, but with joy. Excuse me. Since Paul cannot himself come to Philippi, as you know, he's still in prison, it is his intention to send Timothy as his representative. There was no one so close to him as Timothy, but we know very little about him. But his record of service with Paul shows his fidelity. We cannot tell or when he became a Christian, but on his secondary missionary journey, Paul met him and saw in him one he could clearly use in the service of Jesus Christ. From that time on, Paul and Timothy were very close. Timothy's great use was that whenever Paul wished to send advice or encouragement, or indeed rebuke, and could not go himself, it was Timothy whom he sent. So Timothy was sent to Thessalonica, Corinth, and Philippi. Timothy's great value was that he was always willing to go anywhere, and in his hands a message was safe, as if Paul had delivered it himself. Others might be consumed with selfish ambition, but Timothy's one desire was to serve Paul and to serve Jesus Christ. He is the patron saint of all those who are quite content with the second place as long as they can serve. We are told that in the end, Timothy too was a prisoner for Christ's sake. Then we come to Epaphroditus. When the Philippians heard that Paul was in prison, their warm hearts were moved to action. They sent him a gift by the hand of Epaphroditus. Not only did they intend for him to be the bearer of the gift, they also intended him to stay in Rome and be Paul's personal servant. However, in Rome, he fell ill and was near to death. He knew that the news of his illness had filtered back to Philippi, and that he was worried because he knew that his friends there would be concerned about him. God, in his mercy, spared his life, and so spared Paul yet more sorrow. But Paul knew that it was time that Epaphroditus went back home, and in all probability he was the bearer of the letter. But there was a problem. The Philippian Christians had sent him to stay with Paul, and if he came back home, there would be some who would say that he was a quitter. Here, Paul gives him a tremendous testimonial, which will silence any possible criticism of his return. Paul is making it easy for him to go home. There is something very wonderful here. It is touching to think of Paul, himself in the very shadow of death, in prison and awaiting judgment, showing so much Christian concern for Epaphroditus. He was facing death, and yet it mattered to him that Epaphroditus should not meet with any embarrassment when he went home. Paul was a true Christian in his attitude to others. He was never so immersed in his own troubles that he had no time to think of the troubles of his friends. Amen. So, in summary, there can be no salvation without God, but what God offers man, man must take. It is never God who withholds salvation. It is always man who deprives himself of it. 3 questions for you. Have you taken the prescription? If not, why not? And do you need any help? Thank you.